Welcome to my vlog where we'll be looking at skills and capacities in the weight room and their compensatory and dependent relationship. We will start with back squats. First up we have Wayne, who is limited by capacity. His specific limitation is ankle mobility. My second athlete is Lauren, who is limited by skill. She's a beginner who hasn't squatted many times before. We'll look at Wayne's bodyweight squat to evaluate his range of motion. As you can see, Wayne's knees do not travel past his toes. He's sitting his hips back as far as he can to create depth within his squat. His torso is leaning forwards to counterbalance his hips, and due to this lack of ankle mobility, he's unable to keep an upright torso, which is optimal in the descent of his squat. Next, we're looking at his warm-up sets. During this, he demonstrates the same range of motion of the ankles. His knees never reach the line of his toes in either video. Consequently, we see a non-optimal bar path. Ideally, we want the bar in line with the midfoot, which is represented by the blue line. The bar is further forwards due to torso positioning, which is happening as he compensates for his lack of ankle mobility to achieve depth. Compensation within movement is something athletes will show if they're lacking an element of skill or capacity, and it's something that should be avoided due to compensation being linked to increased risk of injury, as Hewitt et al., Powers and Souza et al. Conclude in their various studies. During the warm-up set, pictured on the right, Wayne squats to above parallel. In the bodyweight squat on the left, he's squatting noticeably lower than the warm-up set. Also notable is the slight kyphosis in the thoracic spine during the bodyweight squat, which allows Wayne to get into this parallel position. But with the bar on his back, he's engaging his lats and maintaining neutral spine, demonstrating technique and skill, but this prevents him reaching the same level of depth as he bodyweight squats, as he cannot compensate by curving his back. Again, this comes back to an inability of the knees to travel further forwards, his ankle mobility limiting this squat. We see the same pattern during these working sets, which are heavier. It's obvious that force production and skill are not limiting factors as he's performing these squats with ease. We see here a compensation relationship between skill and capacity. As mentioned before, Wayne compensates by not squatting as low and dropping his chest, for example, but in order to perform the skill to an optimum level, a balance of skill and capacity are required. His lack of capacity is impacting his skill. He'd be able to perform this skill better if he were not limited by capacity. If the balance of skill and capacity is off, the optimum movement pathway is unlikely to be shown. I asked Wayne and Lauren to perform the knee-to wall drill. This drill has been shown to be a reliable assessment of ankle dorsiflexion range of motion. For good ankle mobility, we're looking at around a 5-inch gap between the toe and the wall, with the knee able to touch. We can see this measurement with the green line. Wayne is not reaching this desired level of ankle mobility, whereas Lauren is. This supports the assessment that ankle mobility and range of motion is the limiting factor for Wayne. This is a common limitation in the back squat for many people, and it can be improved through a number of drills and mobility exercises over time. One of these is using a band for joint mobilisation. We place the band over the ankle on top of the talus bone and gently push the knee as far forwards as we can to increase range of motion in the ankle as much as possible. This drill is helpful in allowing more movement in the ankle and decreasing intrinsic stiffness. We also stretch the soleus and gastrocnemius in case intrinsic stiffness in the calves was part of the problem. After these drills, we went back to the squat and added in a wedge underneath the heels. This created a similar position as weightlifting shoes would with an elevated heel, which allows the knees to travel further forwards. This allowed him to get into a better position in her squat and show a more efficient movement pathway and decrease his compensatory movement patterns. If we compare body position here to the previous working set, we can see the difference. The green line representing how far the knees travel over the toes, and the pink line showing the top of the head demonstrating how far he's leaning forward. The improvements in both of these and depth are clear to see. This strongly shows how ankle mobility is a limiting factor for Wayne, and we can improve his squat by working around these limitations. Next is Lauren and the back squat. Again, I looked at Lauren's bodyweight squat first, and we can see her range of motion is good in her ankles, knees and hips. She can squat well below parallel with the heels on the ground, and her chest is upright while she does this. A small posterior pelvic tilt is noted at the bottom of the bodyweight squat, but this rectifies itself and is no longer present in the weighted squat, so we don't have to worry about loading the flex spine. During Lauren's back squats, we can see her technique isn't consistent throughout the set. She has a tendency to let her chest fall slightly and shoot her hips up, then recorrect the torso, which happens on the first 2 reps before we correct it. This is a common error with athletes who lack the skill of squatting and haven't quite learnt the correct movement pathway. When I asked Lauren to keep her chest up and push through the floor, she's able to perform the back squat in the optimum movement pathway. This demonstrates a lack of skill. Lauren has the capacity to perform the back squat correctly and sometimes does, however she's inconsistent and requires more practice to become proficient at the skill. In order to reinforce the upright torso, we did some goblet squats. Due to the weight being in front, you're forced to keep your torso up during the squat. This is a good derivative to use with athletes who have an issue with keeping the torso up. Similarly, front squats could be utilised for a more advanced athlete. Lauren also lacks capacity in terms of force output as she's a beginner, but currently we're focused on just the barbell. Her force isn't her limiting factor, her skill is. Once her skill improves with practice, we can work on her capacity for force production. Again, skill and capacity are required in balance. There's one which limits the athlete in the most prominent way, and with Lauren that's skill, but to reach her full potential, the athlete will eventually need the balance of both skill and capacity. Next, we'll be looking at the snatch. I'll be looking at Lauren's snatch, demonstrating a lack of skill, and I'll be introducing Faye, who lacks capacity in her snatch, this capacity being overhead mobility. Lauren's first, and we started with hang snatches as there's less to think about than the full snatch from the floor, and we can focus on specific phases of the lift. Lauren's bar path at the end of the second pull loops out around her body. You can see how far the dowel is from her body. We want the bar to stay as close to the body and as straight as possible as we transition from the second pull into the catch. The bar looping out is a very common error with beginners as the load is usually very light, so it's possible and easy to do by accident. We tried a few drills with snatch high pulls from the hip to try and focus on keeping the bar close to the body. This can be helpful as the athlete gets used to having to engage the back and keep the bar close and understand the feeling of triple extension. From the next set, we can see Lauren manages to keep the bar closer and is learning correct bar path. The fact she's able to correct this movement quickly and change from rep to rep demonstrates this is a lack of skill that simply requires practice to become consistent in the movement pathway. We then tried some full snatches from the floor, and you can notice Lauren doesn't extend the knees in the first pull or reach triple extension at the end of the second pull. From this image I've taken, we can see Lauren is trying to keep the bar closer, and she succeeded in keeping it closer than before, but we can also see this lack of triple extension. All of these areas are demonstrating lack of skill and are common with athletes learning to snatch. Snatch high pulls from the floor are very helpful in correcting these issues as they can focus on just the technique of the pull and triple extension. Lauren's catch position is also a little unstable, again due to lack of skill and unfamiliarity with the position. To help with this, we worked on overhead squats. Lauren's capacity to perform these is sufficient. She maintains an upright torso and shows the necessary depth for full snatches. Working on stability and confidence during the overhead squat will help Lauren's catch and recovery phase of the lift. Once more familiar with this position, I would introduce snatch balances and drop snatches too, as these can be incredibly useful in increasing stability. Even with the abundance of capacity that Lauren demonstrates as a beginner, without practicing the skill and being proficient in snatch, she won't reach her potential that her capacity is showing. Again, demonstrating the necessity of balance between skill and capacity. Next, we have Faye, who's limited by capacity. Her overhead mobility limits her within the catch position of the snatch. Faye shows good technique in her first and second pull. I've slowed this video down to half speed so you can see the correct bar path, double knee bend, and triple extension. Here, I always look out for athletes showing an early arm bend or incorrect tracking of the knees, as these are extremely common mistakes. Faye shows neither of these, and I can see she understands the movement pattern. As she turns the bar over, we see her catching the bar in front of her shoulders. This is consistent in all of the reps, and she struggles to stabilise the bar when it's out in front of her head and not balanced over her centre of mass. We looked at overhead squats for Faye to assess overhead mobility in a more controlled movement. The bar is unstable and more over her toes than towards the midfoot, which is what we would want to see from the bar path during the overhead squat. We can see that the bar isn't centred, even from this angle. Faye shows good ankle and knee range of motion in the deep squat position, which suggests the problem is more overhead related than lower body mobility issues. The position overhead is very tricky for a lot of athletes, as it does require very good mobility in the ankles, knees, hips and shoulders. We moved on to some further drills to assess her range of motion. Our first drill is wall slides. Ideally, we want the athlete sat flat against the wall and from the elbows to the back of the hands to be in contact the whole time as the hands slide overhead. You can see the gap between Faye and the wall, and also her elbows not able to touch. She's hyperextending her upper back to try and compensate for this lack of shoulder mobility. This would be affecting her overhead squat position, and it also suggests that if she continues to snatch like this, her back position could start to compensate like it did in the drill, which is something we wouldn't want to encourage, as mentioned before, the increased risk of injury with compensatory movement. We compare this to Lauren performing the wall slides. We can see Lauren is sat flush to the wall and her hands slide up and down the wall, maintaining contact the entire time. This level of shoulder mobility is required to perform overhead squats most efficiently. These wall slides will be beneficial in working on improving Faye's range of motion at the shoulder. We looked at a stretch for the shoulders. Again, comparing Faye and Lauren, it's clear to see that shoulder mobility is limiting Faye as she isn't reaching full shoulder flexion. After the drills and stretches, we went back to snatches for Faye, but this time hip power snatches. We found after the stretching and mobilising, Faye was able to get into a better position overhead during a hip power snatch. The full snatches were still limited by her mobility, but when we removed the squat, Faye was able to get the bar overhead in a better position. This strongly suggests overhead mobility is limiting Faye, not lack of skill. This ability to show better range of motion during the power variation is where stability and mobility interact with one another. As Gray Cook suggests, they have a dependent relationship, and as Faye is more stable in the power position, her mobility is better and more true to her full range of motion. Whereas less stable overhead squat position, she's showing some reflex-mediated stiffness and mobility is compromised to maintain stability. Working on this positioning during powers and improving mobility will allow the position within the full snatch and help Faye utilise the optimal movement pathway. In contrast to Lauren, Faye's skill of snatching is not limiting her. She requires the capacity that she's lacking in order to move in the most efficient way. Much like Wayne in his squat earlier, Faye is compensating and moving in a non-optimal movement pathway due to the limitation. This balance and requirement of both skill and capacity is important for all athletes within their sport. Both are required for the best results and both depend on one another in order to minimise compensatory movement.